Well, let's get into our conversation now. Ahead of May 29 handing over to a new administration, experts have advised policymakers to consider aggressive sectoral reforms to tame inflation and chart roadmap to Nigeria's economic growth. And with the suspension of fuel subsidy removal by the federal government, the question now is, how will the country generate more revenue to cushion the economic crisis facing the nation's economy amid rising inflation? Joining me now to talk on the suspension of the fuel subsidy removal amid revenue crisis is energy lawyer and analyst Dr. Ayodele Oni. It's good to have you join us, as always, on the program. I know that this conversation, we've been going back and forth on this. Should we remove fuel subsidy? Should we not remove it? Now that there seems to be a conclusion from the Buhari administration saying that we should remove the fuel subsidy, and now we hear that there's some kind of suspension, quote unquote. I want to ask you, first off, what are the implications to extending the subsidy removal to the revenue crisis on ground?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that it just tells us that our income isn't going to substantially, or the way we play around our income isn't going to substantially. But to agriculture, to productive activities. So I think that, I think it's expected that we'll spend about 2.55 trillion on subsidies, and you can imagine what that is. So it means it will continue to be a clog in the wheel of our economic growth and development. We're already spending over 90% on repayment of debt. So we thought these were some of the things that change with the removal of subsidy. Now that we understand that whether it's been suspended or they say they are waiting for the next administration to join the team trying to determine when and how, for whatever reason it's going to be stalled now. And it means that the economy will continue to go through some of the challenges it's currently going through.
If you say it will be going through some of the challenges it will be going through when eventually the fuel subsidy is suspended, I wonder how difficult it will be now if people are groaning and complaining about the rise in inflation. Mr. Oni, I don't know if you can still hear me. I'm asking.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Please go on.
I'm asking if people are groaning, as of now that we still have this undecided turf, in the fuel subsidy, on the fuel subsidy discussion. How would it be eventually when the fuel subsidy is finally removed, when the committee comes on board in the incoming administration and they finally remove the fuel subsidy? What would happen to the rise in inflation?
Okay, so you're right. The truth is that at some point we need to bite the bullet. It should happen because it's fiscal rascality for us to be able to pay the sort of subsidies we pay now. Subsidies should go to agriculture, should go to productive activities. If we deal with our economy the way we ought to, such that we add value to the resources we have, then we'll be more prosperous. Now, speaking of inflation and speaking around prices going up, I'll tell you something. I think that even when we remove subsidy, it should be done in phases. And three critical issues should be looked at. First, we should refine locally, because when we import finished products, it increases our cost, or the landing cost. Two, if you ensure that refineries work, that's the first thing. Secondly, ensure that we have public power supply. If we have sufficient, efficient public power supply, sufficient access, and it's public power supply, you'd find out that fewer people use fuel and the quantity everyone uses drops. And the third thing government should use, and I think government should use data. We use data to determine what amount or what percentage each of these factors adds to the actual price of fuel. The third thing is transportation means. Imagine you having, and I've spoken to people who live as far off as Ikorodu, and they say that they spend up to 4 to 5 hours coming to the island every day. But if they go by water, it's an average of 20-25 minutes at the most. So imagine that you cut the travel time. It means you use much lesser fuel. At the end of the day, even if subsidy is removed and these three things are done, we can produce sufficient volumes of petroleum products ourselves. So it cuts off export costs, insurance, freight, ship to ship. Secondly, there's public power supply. Most homes then do not use PMS or whatever it is, or diesel anymore. And thirdly, you have other means of transportation, water in particular. It cuts the quantity. So imagine someone using 100 liters now starts using 10 liters. They would even spend less when you remove subsidy. So it's about government doing what is right. If government doesn't do what is right, it would always be difficult to remove subsidy, or nearly impossible, or it will lead to substantial inflation. But if government can use data and find out what each of these, the percentage increase or the percentage it adds to the actual cost of fuel, each of these factors, then government can actually remove subsidy without a lot of problems. That's what I think. But I think it needs to go, or else it would amount to fiscal responsibility. Imagine 2.55 trillion on paying subsidies alone. Compare that to what's done elsewhere. Our economy is about $414 billion for GDP. Canada is multiples of that, more than five times that. The US is probably 20 times that. And the subsidies are not more than double what we currently pay, whilst their economies are 5 times, 20 times, 10 times bigger than ours. So there's something wrong. There's a mismatch there. And then what do we use the subsidy for? Those are the crucial issues. So it could lead to inflation. It will definitely lead to inflation, and there'll be a bit of crisis if government doesn't take those other important steps to ensure that people use less well and they have other options, alternatives.
I know, of course, this past months has been pretty difficult on a lot of households, you know, when you consider the rise in inflation, the consumer prices, the price of fuel, the traffic that we go through here in Lagos on a daily basis with the construction work that is ongoing. It gives you a sense of how much people spend on petrol. But before we get into what, you know, the implication on the household, I want to ask you, you're suggesting pretty aggressive sectoral reforms now. What would be the impact on the Petroleum Industry Act?
Okay, so the Petroleum Industry Act is a good idea, but I always say that Nigeria's problem isn't laws. Nigeria's problem is implementation. The devil is in implementation. The devil is in ensuring that we do what the law says. And in even putting the law together, you need to get views from people. So I think that the impact of the PIA would only be felt if those three things I've mentioned are done. Because the idea is to ensure that we have profitability, to drive private investment, to drive entrepreneurship in the energy sector. That's what the PIA seeks to do generally. But implementation will always be difficult as long as we don't remove subsidy. Implementation will continue to be difficult as long as those issues, such as not having a power supply. Because speaking of even fuel and all of that, you need to look at it within the context of the macro economic indices. If those are problematic, removing fuel subsidy would only escalate matters, and the Petroleum Industry Act will not necessarily help.
From your suggestions, you know, if you would be advising the incoming administration, since we're waiting for the Buhari administration to bring some persons from the incoming administration on board to see how well they can navigate these waters, what would be your advice to the incoming Tinubu-led administration with regards to the oil and gas industry?
Okay, first, build trust. A major challenge in this part of the world is that the citizenry doesn't trust the government, because promises are made that are never kept. And this is historical. It's not the current administration alone. It's historical. So people do not trust the government. So trust, communicate more. And this is something this government didn't do really well, in my view. Communicate more. First set of things you do. And then you let people know that you will remove subsidy, but it will be done in phases. And you give them
Seem to be having some network issues there.
So as long as we're importing, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. We're having some network glitches. You can go ahead with your point.
Two things. I would ensure there's trust, and I'll communicate more. That's the first thing I would advise the government to do. then I would ensure that the right people, there's certain people where you see in certain positions, it gives you some measure of trust and confidence. That's the third thing I'd advise the government to do. The right people in the right places. And then I'd communicate clearly that subsidy will be removed, but in phases. And then I'd advise government to let people know what those indices are for removing subsidy. We spend 20% of the cost is on importation. When we start producing locally, we would remove 20% of that subsidy. Other 40 or 50% is because we don't have power supply. So a lot of people need to buy fuel every day, particularly PMS and businesses, the small scale enterprises, the informal sector. 50% of that I'll take out once we have sustainable, improved power supply. Then the last 50% is when we can develop other sources of transportation. Each state will develop its own. Lagos should develop water transport so that people have confidence in it. People can move. I live in Ikorodu, for example, the interland. I can drive for 5-10 minutes to a public park, ride and park. I can even, there are trailers, seagoing trailers that can even carry my vehicle to the island. And I drive from the terminal point to my office, another 5 minutes drive. That's 10 minutes instead of 5 hours. So if government can clearly communicate also the basis for removing subsidy and how it will be removed, which I think should be in phases, I think it makes sense and there'll be more support. So it's confidence, right people, proper communication, and letting people know how, why, and what you want to do.
If you take a look at, if we talk about, the quick wins that you've suggested for the incoming administration, but these suggestions look pretty long term. I know you had highlighted some pretty much phased out removal of petroleum subsidy, but what do you think would be the quick wins for this administration?
Okay, to be honest, Darren, in terms of the energy sector, very quickly looking for best means to ensure that we begin to add value to what we already produce. Supporting the Dangote refinery to start production, what government is doing with the Warri and Kaduna refineries, speeding those up. Those are two very important things in terms of adding value. Improve security along gas pipeline network and what the government is currently doing. With respect to power, because energy speaking generally, the Siemens deal, pushing them through and accelerating some of the things that have been done. Because if we speak to power, for example, it's a value chain. If generation is great and transmission is great and there's a problem with distribution, you and I will still not have power. Yeah. If distribution is great and transmission is great and there's a problem with generation, we still will not have power because of the value chain. As long as there's something wrong with a part of the value chain, then there will be a problem. So government needs to accelerate what it's doing with Siemens to improve transmission and distribution, and people would always invest in generation. So I think within the next 100 days from May 29th, those are the quick wins. Ensuring that we quickly finish those projects that are ongoing around the refineries, supporting Dangote to start, ensuring that people trust the government.
Today, I guess it's raining outside. The network is really causing us not to listen to some of the very beautiful suggestions that Mr. Ayodele Oni. Mr. Ayodele Oni, we lost you for a moment. I was wondering if you could go back on some of the points that you're raising. You talked about supporting some of the refineries that are already on mainstream. I wanted to continue from there.
Yes. Yeah, so supporting some of those refineries, one. Secondly, ensuring that the power sector, for example, because that's energy, ensuring that you work very quickly with Siemens, whatever needs to be done to accelerate those things that need to be done quickly. Because the sector, particularly the power sector, is a value chain. If you have great generation, great transmission, and you have issues with distribution, you and I will not get power. If you have issues with transmission and generation and distribution as great, we still won't have power because it's a value chain. So I'll do that, then advise government to put the right people in the right place and very quickly appoint cabinet ministers. I know there's a law that it has to be done within 60 days. I'm not sure that law has been passed, but I know it was in the National Assembly at some point, and I don't know if it's been signed by the president into law. So the president-elect should very quickly appoint his cabinet ministers, ensure that we begin to add value to our resources beyond the base resource, finish some of those projects that have been started by the current administration, because you have long lead times for energy projects. So starting new projects and thinking there will be quick wins will be a big mistake. So finish what we currently have, support the Dangote refineries, finish the Warrior and Kaduna refinery turnaround maintenance that is being done, or upgrades, whatever it is that is being done. I think those are the quick wins government can make as things stand in the energy sector, generally speaking.
Well, to end this conversation, I would like that you end with some projections around the crude oil market. What are your expectations?
I know prices dropped. They dropped in the last 24, 48 hours. I think that I don't expect any substantial drop as long as we continue to have the war in Russia and Ukraine. Now Sudan is becoming a challenge, even though, I mean, from an oil and gas perspective, they don't generate, they don't produce, they're not considered producers. So I don't think that'd be a problem for oil and gas. So I think prices will go down substantially. Production is kicking off in China. I think that all of those would help stabilize oil prices and make them reasonably high. Those are my thoughts around crude oil prices.
Mr. Ayodele Oni, thank you so much. Energy lawyer and analyst, thank you so much for speaking to us on Business Nigeria. Hopefully, some of the suggestions that you have raised will be put to book by the incoming administration, and we look forward to better days. Have a wonderful day, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.